Welcome to Hammer and Vajra, embracing a living pagan tradition through ancestral continuity. This came from a discussion with my friend, the Chad Pastoralist, who you can check out his works that will be linked down in the description of this video. The Chad Pastoralist describes himself as a historian devoted to history and its connection to the modern world. He posts history memes, history posts, and actionable instructions on Wōden worship. I asked him to express this important topic in his own words, and he provided me with this insight. Without further ado, go ahead, Chad.
Oftentimes, some pagans have the idea that European history suddenly stops around 1000 AD, and that modern paganism is about picking up exactly where we left off, leaving a huge gap between us now and our pagan ancestors then, and neglecting the 1000+ years of culture, history, and ancestors in between. The truth is that paganism didn't die or pause the moment our ancestors converted. In addition, neither did our culture or history vanish across time, which, in and of itself, is invigorating, fascinating, and deeply valuable. Even going back as recently as 400 years ago, we find ourselves in the early modern period. Zoning in on England, the culture itself was rich, the manners, customs, ideas, and beliefs. In fact, almost all churches in England during this period had a maypole. Small things like this, so recent in our history, are often overlooked by some pagans who completely disregard the culture and ancestors of this time and other times simply because it wasn't stereotypically pagan or was not pagan enough. Interestingly, it was Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans during the English Civil War who pushed to have church maypoles removed. Before then, most English people would not have thought twice about maypoles, and they were therefore connected to a living pagan tradition. The early modern period, its history, events, and people could be studied almost exclusively, and various modern people of English descent could devote themselves to revitalizing the cultural habits and small traditions of that time by bringing them into the modern world. This could be applied to almost any cultural period in European history. Moreover, English culture from the early to late Middle Ages, which was to a substantial degree ultimately Anglo-Norman, gives us our modern English culture, habits, and attitudes. To ignore this in favor of a revisionist historical viewpoint that history stops when Europe becomes Christian and resumes now with us picking up the pieces is to do a disservice to our entire cultural heritage over the past 1000 years. If Europe had not become Christian, the architectural, artistic, and technological innovations that occurred between 1000 and 1600 AD would still have occurred within a religiously pagan context. For example, observe Lithuania's culture in the Middle Ages. It is therefore valuable to learn about and continue to preserve archaic aspects of our ancestral cultures from the High to Late Middle Ages, in addition to earlier pagan times, as well as the early modern period, and of course, as recently as the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Having a family tree that extends beyond the 18th and 19th centuries helps to establish a sense of continuity back into prehistory, because we garner a sense of where we would be in any given generation. Some modern pagans choose to ignore their entire heritage from the Middle Ages simply because they don't have a family tree. It's easier to identify with projected, mysterious, unknown pagan ancestors than it is with Christian ancestors from the Middle Ages if one lacks a family tree. However, if you know your real ancestors, your family lineage from the 1800s going back to the 1500s, 1400s, 1300s, and earlier, you know yourself. It is perfectly acceptable to identify with our culture and ancestors from the colonial era, the medieval era, or the Victorian era and still be a pagan. It is perfectly acceptable to practice the habits and customs and to take a liking to our ancestors from any century and still be a pagan. For context, historical Germanic pagans depicted the gods in the cultural context of their day and were, for the most part, men and women of their time. They were completely connected to their ancestral heritage, knew their ancestors, and had an established forms of worship without having to think about it. Whereas today, many people don't have that. This is why it is so important to formulate these things. A notable example comes from Adam of Bremen's 11th century Gesta Hamburgensis Ecclesiae Pontificum. In it, Bremen describes the way in which the idols of the gods were adorned at the temple of Uppsala. Wōden is described as wearing armor and wielding weapons, which Bremen likens to portrayals of Mars. This shows that historical pagan Swedes depicted the gods in armor and with weapons that were modern to them in their day. The same is true for the Lindby idol of Wōden, the Rallinga statuette of Freyr, and the Eiraland statuette of Thor, all of which show the gods wearing a conical hat that was common across Scandinavia in the Viking Age. Rather than viewing our history as paganism, gap, revivalism, we should be viewing our history as a continuum. The gods have always existed, and the functional structure and nature of the universe has not changed. Objective reality, that the gods exist, does not and therefore has not changed due to shifts in consensus or changes in cultural context. We should strive to live in the now and cultivate the revitalization of paganism. Enjoy and appreciate all of our history and all of our ancestors. Use the sources on Germanic paganism as a framework to establish our own authentic forms of worship, form real groups, and revitalize our worship of the gods and the veneration of our ancestors.
Thank you, Chad. Chad's input here is rather insightful and mirrors a lot of my most recent thoughts on this matter. I would like to expand upon this great topic by highlighting three things he mentioned: a family tree, identifying with more recent generations versus very ancient pagans, and the gap. Point number one, having a family tree that extends beyond the 18th and 19th centuries. This is a crucial topic, and sadly, it is one of the hardest hurdles for many in the West. I am lucky enough to have a family history that goes back a few hundred years, but I will admit that there was some loss of record for the genealogy that seems to have started with the always blamed, and for a reason, boomer generation. I had to spend a bit of money and do a lot of digging, asking living relatives as old as I currently have for this information. Luckily, I am blessed to have living grandparents in their 90s. I have been able to trace my family lines back to at least the 13th century or older. Historically, many family records weren't officially kept by any government census in certain regions for earlier time periods than this. Thereby, some may find it difficult, but creating a genealogy that goes back as far as you can is a very important endeavor that can help make that connection to the past something more tangible in your everyday life. Next, we'll move on to point number two, identifying with more recent generations versus ancient pagans. This is what I think is the common argument that is made. Believe me, I'm as big of a nerd as the next guy looking towards the Yamnaya, corded ware, hunter-gatherer DNA, and practices from other ancient Europeans and Eurasian groups that might be connected to me or my culture. These ancient ties, especially to our faiths, are very important. They can indeed fill the gaps. But skipping over your more recent ancestry, their achievements, their ideas, and their worldview just because they were Christian is doing them and yourself a disservice. Indeed, the majority of them weren't pagan. Though I would debate all day on how paganism continued to be both hidden and occult, and even overtly, at least culturally, in spirit. You can still be pagan and have Christian ancestors. Chad mentions how if you know these people going back, you know yourself. These family members going back to even the Middle Ages had family members who knew of pagans or who had tales freshly as part of their oral or traditional culture, even if it was demonized. There is no reason to think that all of the culture and customs from these ancestors were all Christianized to the extent that they weren't a part of your folk tradition and need to be thrown out. Also, a lot of information we have for paganism today came from documents from interested peoples of these time periods, not just mystics and revivalists or romanticism from the 1800s, but in illustrations and studies going back to the 1500s. A great example is the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, which depicts Wōden, Thor, and Frigga in the year 1555. Our gods weren't unknown to even our Christian ancestors. Writing regarding King Arthur, Merlin, and even the Celtic gods go back to only around the 1200s. The Celtic manuscripts of the Ulster cycle goes back to the 11th century. Even Adam of Bremen, who wrote about active Saxon pagans in the 11th century as a first-hand account. This brings into question some of the writings of the Scandinavian sagas and poems. Were they really that distant from practicing pagans? Were they that influenced by Christianity? Is there really that much of a gap? The last point I want to discuss is the gap. From what Chad and I are saying, is that we shouldn't view our history as paganism, a gap, and then revivalism. I fully agree with this. There isn't really a need to continue to focus on revival. Your faith shouldn't be revivalism, but living, breathing, belief, and practice. We have enough to fill this so-called gap. Between those who have done archaeology, genetics, and linguistic studies, and those who have already recreated what we need to practice, there is no longer a gap. Allowing this gap to trap you into a constant state of revival or reconstruction, where nothing is good enough until it is 100% peer-reviewed and perfected, isn't a living tradition. Instead, it's holding you back. You can enjoy culture, objects, and efforts from those of your family who weren't pagan and still be pagan today without worrying about filling any gaps. You should start practicing and believing now. Not hesitating because there might be some new discovery that will somehow make Wōden, Thor, Freya, etc. not exist. They exist. They have existed since the beginning and will continue to exist. You don't need a linguist, an archaeologist, or me to tell you that they do and that they are worthy of worship. The majority of your ancestors knew that gods existed. Sure, this doesn't mean you should cobble together anything you don't know about from syncretic missing pieces without thought or comparative reasoning. However, adjusting your faith based on whatever new study releases about genetics or what ex-Viking was buried with isn't useful in the here and now. It doesn't affect your praising of the gods and having a spiritual connection with them, your ancestors, and the spirits in the world today. I am of the mindset that we need to be active today. All of the major gaps have already been filled, and nothing is stopping you from practicing today. I practiced in the line of your ancestors. Sure, we will make changes over time and adjust to be accurate or as skillful in worship and practice as possible. But the divine hasn't changed, nor the method of reaching them. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope this was inspirational and empowered you to sort the wheat from the chaff and begin practicing, believing, and having a spiritual connection with your ancestors, your gods, and the spirits around you in the here and now. I want to thank the Chad Pastoralist for his time. Hammer and Vajra out.